If you're looking to take your running to the next level, you're going to need to master your running intensities. In this video, I'm going to show you how I use power, heart rate, pace, and RPE to optimize my training and performance. Running intensities can be categorized into 4 main levels: easy, moderate, threshold, and high intensity. Each intensity level triggers specific adaptations in our bodies, making us more efficient runners. But to optimize our training, we've got to have some way of ensuring that we are actually running at the intensity we think we are. Whereas testing things like blood lactate in a lab is ideal, it's not practical for daily training. And so we use proxies. We use things like pace, heart rate, power, and RPE to try and estimate the intensity to run at. And that's worth repeating. We use these things to estimate our intensity. These metrics aren't goals in themselves. They're simply tools we use to target specific metabolic states. Because if we become fixated on hitting a certain pace, for instance, and lose sight of the true goal, which is stimulating a specific metabolic state, then we're likely to miss the whole goal of the workout altogether. If it's meant to be a threshold run, and we stick to a prescribed pace even though it's uphill and it's windy, then we're going to miss that threshold stimulus that we were looking for. The intensity will be too high because we've had to use too much energy to overcome the effects of the wind and the incline. And so the session now starts to move more towards a VO2 max session, except it's not going to do much there good either because it's not quite intense enough for a VO2 max session. And so we're left with this session that's neither here nor there, which is not optimal. So I'm going to show you how I use all of these metrics to really nail my intensities, to use several different data points to triangulate and hone in on exactly where I want to be every single time. Because there isn't one metric that's best all of the time. They're all useful in different situations. For example, heart rate is really good for lower intensity running, but it's no good for shorter interval work because your heart rate takes a good 4 minutes to reflect your running intensity. And so your interval will be over by the time your heart rate's had a chance to come up. There's also something called cardiac drift, which is where your heart rate becomes decoupled from your intensity level and continues to rise even though your effort level remains the same. It's also affected by a whole load of external factors like temperature, sleep, fatigue, hydration, sickness, and then there's the problem of setting your heart rate zones in the first place, but that's a whole other video. Pace is a simple and familiar metric that's available on almost every smartwatch, but again, it's greatly affected by things like wind, temperature, terrain, elevation, fatigue, and so it's not always an accurate representation of your running intensity. And even when conditions are right to be using pace, it's only ever going to be a rough estimate because your running paces are calculated using formulae based on thousands of different runners. So it's never going to be specific to you, and the range of pace is going to be quite wide. RPE can be a really good metric, but its main disadvantage is that it requires experience. If you're a beginner, it's no good me telling you to run by feel because you have no point of reference. You don't know how it's supposed to feel. It can also get you into some hot water in a race scenario as well. And that's because at the start of a race, no intensity ever feels very hard. So it's very easy to push too hard then, only to really pay for it later on in the race. It's also very subjective and can vary according to things like mood and any other number of factors. But that's actually one of its advantages as well. Rather than stubbornly chasing a pace during a training session, if you're running by feel and you're not fully recovered from your previous session, your body will naturally adjust. You'll naturally pull back and adjust for the conditions of the day. So RPE is a really good metric and one that's certainly worth practicing and becoming familiar with. And lastly, we come to power. In my experience, power can be the most versatile and useful metric to use, especially if you're using the Stride foot pod. And that's because this pod adjusts for temperature, it adjusts for wind, altitude, humidity, elevation. There's no lag, so you can use it for short sprint work. So what all that means is it doesn't really matter what the conditions of the day are, you can always nail your intensities with this pod. It's always going to give you an accurate representation of your intensity level. But there's no agreement as to what running intensity actually is. And so you're going to get different readings depending on which device you use, because different manufacturers use different models. Now, I personally think that if you're running by power, you kind of have to be using the Stride pod, and this thing isn't cheap. You're going to need an accurate FTP or critical power. So what that means is you're going to have to do regular all-out time trials, which certainly isn't for everyone. There's also a learning curve, and it adds an additional layer of complexity which some will enjoy, but not everyone. So I find it best to have a primary metric to work with and then use a secondary and tertiary metric to fine tune. So that way I can triangulate 3 or 4 different data points to really hone in on the intensity I'm after with confidence. Let's go through a few running intensities and I'll show you what I mean. The easy run. Such an important intensity to master, but one that we often run too fast. And I think that's because we can trick ourselves into thinking it's too slow to be doing us any good, but we just have to trust the science. Remember, we're not aiming for a pace, we're not looking to impress anyone, we're looking to stimulate that low to mid aerobic pathway. So trust the process. So for the easy run, I'm mainly using RPE, so it should feel like 3 out of 10. And of course I'm checking in with power and heart rate as I go. But if you're just starting out, I definitely recommend keeping a close eye on heart rate, because it's so easy to push too hard on these easy runs. So you need to be keeping your heart rate below about 70% of your maximum. And don't be afraid to slow down. So if you find that you're running as slowly as you think you can, but your heart rate's still climbing, just walk for a bit. And that's actually really normal. A lot of people, when they start running, depending on your starting level of fitness, can't actually sustain a full workout of running at an easy pace without that heart rate getting too high. So if that's you, walk for a bit. When your heart rate comes down, run for a bit. Patience is key. Trust the process. It works. So the tempo run is a moderate intensity run that we'll often target during the long run. And most people's marathon pace is towards the top of this zone. So for this one, I'm typically using power as my primary metric. Checking the heart rate for the first 90 minutes. So the reason just the first 90 minutes is because after that, my heart rate's probably going to start to become decoupled from my intensity level. But for the first 90 minutes, it's good. So I'm looking to keep my power between about 80 and 90% of my critical power, which it is, and my heart rate I'm looking to keep between 136 and 146, which is my zone 3, and we're bang on. The threshold run is next. Such a crucial intensity for long distance runners to get right. And most people's half marathon pace will fall somewhere within this zone. So once again, typically I'm using power as my primary metric, checking with heart rate regularly, and also RPE. So it should feel like a 6 or 7 out of 10. So for power, I'm looking to stay between 90 and 100% of my critical power, and the heart rate between 146 and 160. But remember, those figures are for me, they're not for you, so don't copy them. So checking in now, get quick. So I'm right at the top of my threshold zone now, and that's an interesting thing with RPE. You have to get used to it, because at the start of your run, you can often overcook it.
because you're not fatigued, it feels easy, which is what happened just there. So I've pulled it back a bit. I'm now at 304 watts. My heart rate is 143. Now that's below my threshold zone, but I've only just started the run. So that's going to come up soon. My RPE is right on, about 6 out of 10, spot on. 5K intensity. So at this point, I'm pretty much using power exclusively. I'll look at heart rate at the end of a race, for instance, just to make sure that I got near the end of my max. But during the run, I'm relying on power. So I'm looking to stay at about 106% of my critical power. So I'm a bit above. And once again, RPE is good, but I need to practice that at this intensity because, as you can see, when you just start, it doesn't feel that bad. But if this was towards the end of a 5K race, there is no way I'd be talking to you. I'd be completely redlined and unable to talk. So I'm bang on where I need to be. Let's go. So the last intensity we're going to cover is high intensity interval work. So at this point, I'm exclusively using power as my metric. Heart rate's going to be completely useless because the intervals are so short. Heart rate's going to take way too long to come up. So the intensity with this one ranges a lot depending on the distance of your interval. But if I wasn't using power, I'd be using pace. So probably going around a track and timing laps is another really good one. So just to demonstrate why heart rate's no good, at the moment I'm at 125. I'm going to move into an intensity I'd use for about a 200 meter rep, and then we'll see where the heart rate is at the end of it. Okay, so I definitely overcooked it there in terms of power. My heart rate's only 155, which according to my zones puts me in threshold zone, but there's no way me making 480 watts is threshold. So power's good at that intensity, so is pace. So I hope you feel a little closer to mastering your running intensities now, and how you can intelligently use multiple metrics and combine them to really nail your intensities. If you can do that, you'll be training smarter, you'll be running faster, and you'll be making progress like you wouldn't believe. But remember, consistency is king, so lace them up and go get it.